Are we good to go?
Think so. Yeah, I think we're set.
All right. Well, again, welcome everybody. And I do want to apologize for the technical difficulty we had with getting this class started. But it looks like we got it fixed, and we got 20 plus people signed on. So, all right. Well, let's get started. My name is John Teravskis. I'm with WGR Southwest. I'm a CPESC, a QSP, QSD. I'm a trainer of record. I've taught a lot of SWP classes over the years. I think we've been teaching these QSP, QSD classes now for, 11 years or so. And I've had probably in the tune of 1,100, 1,200 students through that. And I think I recognize many of you as being former alumni. So welcome to the Stormwater Awareness Week workshop. So what we're going to be talking about today is SWPs that work and don't break the bank. Okay, so I want a little feedback today. You can use your chat if you want. What makes a SWP program so expensive in your opinion? What makes it expensive? Go ahead and type in something if you got something. Just in your chat there, you can at the bottom of your screen. What makes a SWP program so expensive? A little feedback. Or if you want, if you're brave, you can unmute yourself and talk to me. I'd love to have someone talk to me. Overreaching inspectors, yes, many times, true. What else? What makes a SWP so expensive, either to write or to implement? You could give me either side of it. Or do you feel that SWPs are too expensive? So, well, I'm going to share my screen, but if you got other things you want to add in, go ahead and add it in to the text there. So let's talk about SWPs. And, you know, it's important that we have cost-effective SWPs, and not just in the writing of them, but the implementation of them. Because many times, just a second, I'm getting some of my settings here. I want to be able to see your chats if you do bring in a chat. All right, bad installation of BMPs is what somebody said, or lack of understanding of how to install and maintain BMPs. Well, Jason, it's like you read my workshop already. That's exactly where we're going today. So, yeah, how many times have we heard this, either from a contractor or the owner of the project? It's just too expensive. I can't afford it. Whether that's the writing of SWP, and that would be the cheaper part of it, or the installation. Or how many times have you, maybe as a SWP writer, put into a SWP, I think we should use hydraulic mulch here, maybe with a certain poundage, 3,500 pounds per acre, and we need to use a certain amount of seed. And you get the estimate from the installer, and you know it's extreme sticker shock. It's just like, you got to be kidding me. It's going to cost how much? And that's a commonality that we see across the sites, whether it's a large business, big developer putting it in, or just a small mom and pop doing maybe an infill project. The commonality we hear is it's just too expensive. Well, that's what we're going to talk about. And of course, the expenses aren't avoidable. We got to spend the money. We got to do the work. It is a requirement. So let's first talk about what makes a SWP workable. And then we'll talk about, since we got to live with this, how can we make it more cost effective and more manageable for the contractor or the owner of the project. So when we talk about whether something's workable or cost effective, of course, there's two perspectives, right? We have the contractor perspective. And the contractor perspective, and I'm not just talking about contractors say, I'm not doing any of it. There are those out there. But I'm talking about a contractor who really is trying to do a good job, not only in their project, but also they want to comply. They want to comply. But when you ask a contractor what makes a SWPPP workable, it's things like this. It's realistic. I mean, how many of you have seen SWPPPs that are not realistic? You know, in the early days, as I was teaching classes about BMPs, we do this practicum where they actually have to spend one morning working as a group, putting BMPs on a paper. And we early on came up with the house rule. It's got to be realistic because people are going, we're going to put a tent over the whole site. No, you're not. Or I even had somebody say, we're going to plant a banyan tree. Hey, we're not in Hawaii. But it's got to be realistic. But that is, in a contractor's mind, it's got to be realistic for each phase of the project. Like, do you have demolition on your project? Well, you need to have BMPs that line up with that demolition phase, not just for the grading phase or for the vertical construction phase. Your BMPs got to be realistic for the entire project, for each phase of the project. The next thing is they need to be doable BMPs. What is something that's not doable? Well, many times, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is trying to get vegetation to establish in an area that we don't have irrigation in the middle of summer. That's just not going to happen. We're going to have to apply some water. We're going to have to apply something to make that vegetation grow. You can't just put hydroseed down and expect it to come up on its own in the middle of summer. So the BMP has to be doable, no matter whether it's the big final spraying the site down with a hydromulch and hydroseed, or whether it's just what perimeter controls we pick. We can pick perimeter controls that are not doable. You know, you don't want to be putting fiber roll across a place that's going to be ran over by traffic constantly. And so they need to be doable. Also, from the contractor's perspective, they need to be cost effective. Of course, you know, this is assuming a contractor is willing to spend the dollars. You know, we're not talking about that contractor who's like, I'm not doing anything. No, they have a budget. They have BMPs that they've set aside in the budget to implement. But we want to make sure that the BMPs that we're specifying are cost effective. That may not always be the cheapest BMP, because if we go with a more expensive BMP that is more durable and needs to be replaced often, that very well could be a cost-effective BMP. Now, we have a saying around here that we say to lots of clients: compliant and no more. Compliant and no more. It's kind of a buzzword that we use here. We want to be compliant, but we don't want overkill. And so a workable SWPPP from a contractor's perspective is basically that philosophy. It needs to be compliant and nothing more, unless in few rare circumstances it makes good financial sense maybe to do some more. But generally speaking, we want to meet the requirements, but we don't want overkill. And then, of course, to the contractor, they just want to be kept out of trouble. They just want to make sure that at the end of the day, they don't have an inspector hassling them. Now, they might have an inspector hassling them, but they want to know that they are in compliance. And so they want a SWPPP program, they want it doable, they want it cost effective, they want it compliant, and to keep them out of trouble. Now, that's the contractor's perspective, a perspective of a contractor who actually wants to do the right thing. But let's talk about the water board perspective. Sometimes we think of these as maybe two different sides of the coin, and sometimes they are. But what's important to that water board person when they think the term workable SWPPP? Well, the first thing is it's compliant. Again, it shares commonality with the contractor. Contractor wants to be compliant, wants to be kept out of trouble. The water board wants a SWPPP that's compliant too. And what is our judge of compliance? Well, it's the construction general permit. More specifically, if it's based on your risk level. If you're risk level 1, you're going to look at attachment, you probably know it, C, right? Or if you're risk level 2, attachment D, or risk level 3, attachment E. So you're going to take a look at that attachment, those BMPs that are prescribed in that attachment, and that's what the water board is going to judge your site on. They're going to want, you know, if you're risk level 2, they're going to pull out attachment D and say, is it compliant? Is it complying with these minimum mandatory BMPs in attachment D? The water board's also looking at the big picture. At the end of the day, is it minimizing erosion? Is it achieving the goals of the construction general permit to protect water quality? In other words, it's minimizing erosion, it's eliminating offsite sediment deposition, and then finally, is it establishing that final site stabilization when the project's over? Those are the real objectives of the construction general permit. And all of that could be put under the last term, and this is probably the biggest picture for the water board, is does it protect water quality? So it's these two perspectives then that we need to bring together in order to really achieve a workable SWPPP, a SWPPP that is going to be effective, it's going to make sense, and it's not going to be overkill, and therefore it's not going to hopefully break the bank, or at least we should say the budget that was set up on appropriate BMPs. All right, so when it comes to writing these realistic workable SWPPs, there are some understandings that are needed by the Slipwriter. And sadly, I find this lacking many times in SWPPs that I review. I not only write quite a few construction SWPPs for lots of different projects, but many municipalities have hired us to help review erosion sediment control plans or SWPPs that were submitted for larger projects. And in reviewing many other SWPPs, I've noticed that sometimes there's some fundamental misunderstandings when it comes to construction. So let's talk about these 5 understandings that are important. One is to understand the scope of the project. And by that, we mean what trades are going to be there. Because every activity, every trade has a potential impact on stormwater quality, on the quality of the runoff from the site. Even electricians, who many times don't even get mentioned in SWPPs, can have a negative impact on water quality. Sometimes if they're putting in conduit, those PVC glues and various things that they're using can cause a spill or enter stormwater. Now, typically electricians wouldn't be way high on our radar as far as potential pollutants, but it's a cumulative effect. We want to look at not only electricians, we want to look at the drywallers, the installation or insulation installers, the roofers, the AC guys, the asphalters, we want to look at all of these trades, of course, the painters, and all the way to the landscapers. So when we want to write a SWPPP that's effective, we're not only looking at demolition and grading and earthwork, but we want to look at all the different things that are happening during the vertical stage. A problem that many SWPPP writers make is they just call it vertical stage, and they mean everything that's included in that. But they fail to recognize that there are some very specific threats to water quality by the different trades, by the different activities. So you want to identify who those are. The second understanding is to understand the limitations and requirements of the project. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, certain projects, in fact, most projects have restrictions. They have limitations put on by different people. Sometimes it's by the owner themselves, especially for agencies. They will have certain BMPs that they accept and other BMPs they don't. A common one that we see is there'll be no monofilament netting used in your BMPs. Therefore, if I'm speccing out fiber roll, I want to make sure that we're not using that monofilament netting, that we're using more of a biodegradable burlap type of compost sock rather than that. But there's many different types of potential owner specifications. So as a good SWPPwriter, one of the first things you need to do is get the specifications for that job, if it exists. Not every job has them, but certainly most public jobs, almost all public jobs will have specifications. So what might we look for? Well, we might look for not only the type of BMP or things that are prohibited, but they might be certain bid items that they were only allowed to use. So I might want to look at the bid items for what type of sediment controls are allowed. Perhaps compost socks are allowed, but fiber rolls not, or vice versa. Perhaps silt fence is a bid item, but compost socks not. Perhaps gravel bag is a bid item, but compost socks not. One way or the other, there may be certain restrictions just based on the bid item, and that if I can work within that, then that is going to be a good thing, and it's going to help satisfy the owner's requirements and make my SWP most likely more effective and more doable to the contractor. Nothing irritates a contractor more than to specify a BMP that is not on the bid list, that's not on a bid item, especially for projects that have a real tight control over what you can and can't use. So you want to look at that. Now, not every project's that way, but some are. So you want to look at that. Other types of things that you might want to look at the owner specifications is they may have certain sequencing, they may have certain schedules that they're wanting from that built into that SWP. Now, another thing, since you're looking at the specifications, usually what comes with that is also the environmental permits. And so you want to look at the other environmental permits to see, do they have restrictions? For example, if they're doing in-water work or levee work or something like that, they probably have a 401 water quality certification, a 404 U.S. Army Corps permit, and probably a Section 1600 or Department of Fish and Wildlife lake or stream bed alteration agreement. And in those documents, in those permits, many times will be restrictions about when you can do activities and what type of vegetation you're going to install. So I can't go out and just spec out my favorite wildflower mix if an environmental permit is requiring a certain type of wildflowers. So understanding those limitations and requirements to the project will take you a long ways to having a workable, doable, realistic SWP. Now, I mentioned schedule here in a moment. Schedule might be found in those documents, but it might also be dependent on what the contractor's wanting to do. And so understanding the contractor's schedule is really important to also have a realistic SWP. Like when is the grading happening? When will we be moving to underground and streets and roadway work? And when will vertical construction happen? Or maybe there's different phases in that. So understanding their schedule is really important. Now, I get it. I understand. You know, I saw Zach Wong's on the call here. He's a civil engineer. There's nothing harder than writing a SWP than for a civil engineer, because when the civil engineer is writing it, so little is known about the project. Where usually consultants like WGR, we have the luxury of knowing who's the contractor on the job, and usually many times a schedule has already been established. Now for engineers like Zach and his group, the job hasn't even gone out to bid. They have no idea when it will actually happen, who will do it. And so some of this is really difficult for them to establish. So in that case, lots of times we see a skeleton SWP written, or, you know, rather than just taking a guess, a wild guess, you know, an uneducated guess, lots of times it'd be better just to say this section of the SWP will be established once the job has gone out to bid. But when you can get, you know, understand what that project, the sequencing of that project, also understand the dynamics of the project. Now, this is where a lot of SWP writers go awry. You know, unfortunately, there's so much you need to know about the industry, not only the environmental industry, but the construction industry in order to be a good construction SWP writer. And not everybody comes to it with a real broad experience. It would be great if SWP writers were all environmental degreed, you know, students from, you know, from a university, but also spent 5 years in construction, learning that trade as well too, because then they would be able to understand it. So sometimes we have someone who really understands construction, but they don't quite understand the permit well enough. Or sometimes we have people who really understand the permit. They know what the permit's requiring, but they don't understand what the project is really going to involve. And so understanding what does the project look like today or at the beginning, and how will it change as we go from each phase of the project. And then finally here, understanding is the flow of the project. Now, I'm not just talking about the scheduling, but more importantly, water. How does water flow across the site? Now, we have great tools today. Google Earth, we can do a lot with today. We can, in fact, even now, that you can go back in time. Many times I can look at an aerial image for a wet season to see what the pre-construction looks like, even where it's ponding or puddling. Certainly we can look at slopes. Of course, there's nothing better than having boots on the ground and going out to the job site before you write the SWP. That's always ideal, but not always achievable or financially doable or even necessary. We can write many good SWPs without going to the site, except for the more complicated situations. So, but having a good understanding of where does water come onto the site, how does water go across the site, and where does it leave or places it leaves, that is absolutely necessary for writing realistic SWPs. But there's one more, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about, is your BMPs, getting an understanding of your BMPs. Not every SWP writer has a good understanding. In fact, that was one of the comments, was not understanding how to install and maintain BMPs. So we're going to go through 5 in particular. Scheduling, we're going to talk about perimeter sediment controls, we're going to talk about effective soil cover, trackout control, and then final site stabilization. So let's go to scheduling. Why must all good projects start in October? I mean, here it's Stormwater Awareness Week, right? That's why we call it that, because officially, or you know, October 1 is the start of the storm season. Now, whether it rains on October 1, probably not. We probably won't get good rains until November in most places in California. But this is a time of year we start thinking and preparing for the stormwater season. So I guarantee you projects will start next month. I can already think of quite a few. I know it personally that will start next month. So that really leaves a tight calendar, is what we found, is because you got to get your grading in, you got to get your underground in, and then what we try to advocate, as you'll see here in a moment, is get that first lift of asphalt down or get those roadways in so we have something stabilized to work on. But they start in October many times, and that really tightens things up and makes it hard to comply. The other thing is, again, I referred to this earlier, but talk to the contractor when you have the luxury to do that. Of course, you know, we already talked about people who, you know, can't do that. But when you have the ability to talk to the contractor, talk to them about the phasing of the project. What are they anticipating? Because what we're talking about here is having a SWPPP that's doable, that is realistic, that can work, and thereby is more cost effective. And then ask yourself this question. And in fact, this is a good discussion question with the contractor. What can we do now to help our situation later? Now, let me show you some pictures of bad scheduling. This is bad scheduling. What are we looking at? Well, the picture on the left is, although it wasn't raining right then, this was during, I think this was during the 2018 season when we got a lot of rain. And this roadway should have been paved quite earlier in the project, but because they delayed, this area turned into a mud bowl and basically got muddier and muddier and muddier. And the contractor had to over excavate this road several times during the during the wet season, just in order to get vehicles in and out of the project. I mean, that's an expense. That is an inefficiency. That's something we're trying to avoid. And so having those conversations with the client will help do that. The other one is a fast food restaurant that was being built in the valley here, and same deal. They had every opportunity in the world to put in the pavement, the parking lot, the driveways. They had every opportunity to do that before the rains came in. Quite a nice window. They didn't start in October. They started early in the summer. They had all the opportunities, but people want to just do what traditionally is done. And therefore, because paving's not usually done to the end, they waited. Well, they got themselves into the same boat. They were having to over excavate just to maintain access. Yes, we understand that having 2 lifts of asphalt is more expensive than 1 lift. But you have to weigh the cost of doing all this over excavation, dealing with extra track out issues, and compare that to requiring in a second mob to do the second lift of asphalt. A lot of people are finding that is much more cost effective. Feel free to text in comments or questions. I'd love to see your comments on it. All right, second one, BMP that we want to talk about is perimeter controls. Now, here's one misunderstanding. When we hear the word perimeter, we think perimeter. We think around the site. Well, perimeter doesn't always mean perimeter when it comes to construction SWPPs. When we're talking perimeter, we're talking about where water's going to flow or could flow off site. So at the top of a hill, it's probably not a perimeter we're too concerned about. Or when we're going down a slope, that might have perimeter controls, but not an up and down waddle or fiber roll or device, but probably more of a check dam type of perimeter control for that situation, or linear sediment controls going down the hill. So picking the wrong BMP or doing a bad installation just will, one, aggravate you because it won't work, and second, it'll probably waste your money. And so in wanting to have SWPPs that are cost effective, it is very important to pick the right one. So aren't they all the same? That's what we hear a lot. And if you've had any of my talks or heard any of my talks, you've probably seen these, so I'll go through these rather quickly. But just to show the differences here. So a fiber roll, a lot of people think fiber roll's filtered. They do not. Notice the flow, but the flow arrow went up and over. Fiber rolls are basically little dams when they're installed correctly. That's what they're meant to do. They're meant to slow the flow, settle out the particles. They're not meant to filter out stormwater. They don't filter out stormwater. They stop the flow effectively, let it build up and settle out solids. Now, Compost Socks, on the other hand, they do filter. And so the flow passes right through them. Now, it does slow it down, so it does cause a lot of settling to happen too. But it also will capture the flow going through it, capture the particles, retain onto them. And a compost sock that is Yeah, as seasoned and has been in service will typically weigh 2 to 3 times its weight as it was installed because of the sediment it has caught. And many times it'll even become more effective as it becomes more seasoned. Of course, it will have a lifespan and will need to be replaced at some time. All right, here's a question. Excelsior fiber rolls are billed as acting as a filter instead of a dam. Would you agree with this? First off, there are a lot of fiber rolls out there. So just by the term using Excelsior means to me they're probably less dense than your typical fiber roll. I would need to look at what particular product we're looking at because there are tons of products out there right now. But your traditional fiber roll is not. Once you stuff it with a straw, whether it's rice straw or wheat straw or any other straw, once you stuff it and it's that compacted in, it does not filter. It's possible there are some products out there that do filter. Now here's another thing, and this is something that we point to make your SWPPPs more cost effective, is use things that already exist. So we already saw how a fiber roll works. Slows the flow and lets particles settle out. Now, does the flow care what slows it? No, it doesn't. It just knows I've slowed down, and therefore I'm going to drop some particles out. So in certain places where we have an interface between softscape and hardscape, it's a good place to consider the possibility of using a curb cutback. Now, curb cutbacks aren't for everywhere, and it's not for everywhere you have that interface. There are places where you don't want concentrated flows headed towards that sidewalk or impervious surface because you don't want any undermining or you don't want to affect the integrity of it. But there are other places where it works just fine, and maintaining a 4 to 6 inch difference between the top of the hardscape to the softscape does exactly the same thing as the fiber roll. Now, the problem is that we tell a lot of people is it doesn't look like a BMP, right? And that's a problem for two people. One is the people on site. If they don't see a BMP there, then they're not understanding maybe the importance of maintaining that 4 to 6 inches. The other is sometimes inspectors don't see something that looks like a BMP there, and so they may even give you a hard time about that. So what do we see people do? We see them put a fiber roll, just lay it on the top of that sidewalk there. What's that do for you? Nothing. And then when to use fiber rolls versus silt fence? Well, this is really just a matter of loading. How much load are you expecting to capture and need to capture? So a fiber roll will, obviously only capture a few inches effectively of sediment, maybe 4 at the most. Silt fence, its design is 50% its height, so around 18 inches is how much of a sediment load a silt fence could, at least in theory, handle. Of course, there's lots of things that go into that, like the amount of water, the velocity, and other things that go into that. But your loading would determine that. So here's some pictures from the field. You can see the silt fence there. That's failure, probably mostly in managing the site, but also understanding the flows. You can see erosion coming across there. Of course, you got bad site management happening in that picture here. Here is actually, it doesn't look like a fiber roll until you look really closely. It's what we call Pancake Waddle. This is a wrong BMP to pick from here, because obviously they have a lot of foot traffic, a lot of activity there. That fiber roll was just destined to become destroyed. Probably not a great BMP there. Maybe a gravel bag, a compost sock might have worked better there, so that if you did need to do something, you could pull it out of the way, do what you needed, put it right back in place. Fiber roll once it's keyed in, staked down, there's not really an easy way of pulling it back and doing anything with it. So this is an example where maybe the SWPPPP didn't spec out the right thing. And here's something that looks good, but it's missing some other elements. But we have this nice sidewalk right there, and we'd have to ask ourselves, could curb cutback have worked there just as well, if not better? And that would have saved the contractor money from having to purchase that fiber roll and install it, where they could have maybe just taken a skip loader with a GAN and cut a nice elevation difference there. All right, and then here's one where this was a bad misunderstanding as far as what needed to happen on the slope. You can see utter failure, utter failure. So in this case, they applied linear sediment controls to something, well, maybe they needed to be there, but the BMP they forgot to apply or didn't think of was run-on controls. Run-on coming off onto that slope needed to happen. And so they had epic failure there. All right, so let's talk about another BMP, effective soil cover. Well, as you know, erosion starts with a raindrop. If you've been in any of my classes, we talk about the 5 stages of erosion, and raindrop is the first one. So the name of the game here is don't let junior, the junior raindrop, hit the exposed soil. And so we just need to get a cover down. Temporary is good. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it's the best, most appropriate BMP to go with, something that's temporary. Like here you see plastic that is laid out as a temporary BMP to get them past this storm event until they were ready for something more permanent. But permanent is better. Why? Because once we got the permanent in, we don't have to worry about it as much. It takes less maintenance, and it's something we were going to do anyway, so that is better. So here's some examples. Here's permanent installed early at a project. Now this is probably what that fast food restaurant should have done, and we see a lot of projects now doing this, and it performs phenomenally. When you get these sites asphalted like this with the first lift of asphalt, a lot of the problems just go away. Or on the right, you see a temporary, which could be permanent. The only difference between temporary and permanent with this sprayed on material is whether it contains seed or not. If it's just hydraulic mulch, then it's a temporary BMP. And that is a good maybe way to stabilize that slope if we're going to go through the winter and we're going to rework it later. We probably don't want a lot of growth in it, so we want to just go with hydraulic mulch. But in this case, just looking at it with the drainage culvert there, I'm thinking they were meaning this to be more permanent. And so it would contain seed, and hopefully with the first rains become well established and become a permanent. But if we're talking dollars and your bang for your buck, your best bang for your buck, there's nothing better than straw. Straw is my go-to. Now, there are places we don't want to use straw. Steep hillsides, straw is not usually the best. We don't want it for that. Although we can apply a tackifier and maybe get to a certain steepness, but once we get really steep, we want something that binds better to the soil. Straw is also not a great one if we're going to rework that area in the near future. It can be just a lot of biomass that we got to deal with. But for something that we're going to let sit for quite some time, straw, whether it's hand scattered or machine spread, is the most cost-effective way. And then you put a tackifier on top of that, spray a light tackifier on there, basically a glue with some smaller cellulose to help lock down the straw particles in place. That works extremely well. And there's nothing more durable than straw. we've out here in our construction sandbox have had straw applications last years without needing maintenance. Okay, Trackout controls our next one that we want to talk about. Now, this is where a lot of things can go wrong, and this is where it can get expensive. So we want to design them properly. First off, proper design is per the Casca or the Caltrans cut sheet for TC1, and most people are familiar with that now. But some of the things that get left out of what people call TC1 is, one, the track out control device should drain back onto the project, not off the project. If it drains off the project, your asset has just become a liability. And the other thing that is often left out of these is to have a settling basin or trap or a place you can wash sediment out into next alongside of it. The reason for that is, again, to control your flow, but the other is so to maintain it. You can take a fire hose then, wash out that rock and those grizzlies and get the sediment down into your basin, and that'll make it so much easier to maintain it. So you really want to design these and position these in the right places. Now, the problem is they're expensive and they're fairly permanent, or, you know, they're fairly durable. You don't just pick these up and move them. What you're going to have to do is demolish it and build another one somewhere else. So one of the things we're really advocating to a lot of people these days is this. I am really becoming a fan of these Trackout mats. Now there's different people. I got one manufacturer here called Get Fods. There's no endorsement here. They don't even know I'm showing it to you. There's several. I think I've seen 3 or 4 really good ones. You can just Google Trackout control mat and you'll probably see them. And I really, really like these. One, they're fairly lightweight. They can be moved around fairly easily. And that's one of the things we've noticed is that Trackout for control points for many projects tend to move, especially roadway projects. They tend to change places or even subdivisions. So this makes it so that, yeah, you might have a higher investment up front, but chances are good you're going to be able to reuse these over and over and over again. And you still will design it similar to TC1 so that they're draining into the site. Now this one shows it going down site, but it doesn't look like it's really leaving the construction site per se. But you want it to drain it into the site, and you want it to go to a sediment trap, just as you would a TC1. But I believe these are really probably the future and a very cost-effective way for someone who has to do a lot of Trackout controls. And then the final BMP that we want to talk about is final stabilization. We need to understand what's allowed for an NOT, a notice of termination, and what's not allowed. See, that's where we have a big misconception too, is there's still a lot of people who want to leave exposed dirt. Hopefully most now understand that's not allowed. Leaving exposed dirt is not allowed, although I still get a lot of questions saying, hey, my outdoor work is all pretty much done. We're just doing construction now on the building. Can I get an NOT? The answer is no, you can't, because the requirement for an NOT is that all construction activities have been completed and that the SWPPP has been fully implemented, and the SWPPP goes through that vertical phase of construction. And then another one is that all the post-construction BMPs have been installed and are operating. So no, as long as construction is continuing, you cannot get an NOT. But you're also not going to get an NOT if you have any exposed soil surfaces. And so what you want to do is use something to cover that. And we found that compost and wood mulch are great ways to do that. They're considered by the state to be permanent stabilization, quite common as you see in this picture for landscaped areas. But there's always these small little areas that we see in projects that end up in the pictures being sent to the water board, to the regional board for an NOT, and they're dirt. And so they leave them there. So putting down some compost is very cost effective and a great way to not get your NOT rejected. And by the way, what we charge for each NOT will pay for a lot of compost. So if you're paying a consultant to do an NOT for you, you only want it done once. You don't want to get it rejected. So the cost in our consulting to do another submittal would have bought that compost. Here's a question. If all exterior work is completed and just interior work is finalizing, we have obtained NOTs. Yeah, Paul, I did overstate that because of the amount of questions I get. I have seen a few projects get NOTs, and it may depend on what regional board you're in. The thing is, there can be no signs of construction outside, like dumpsters, porta potties, staging areas. They got to be gone. Basically, if someone drives up to your site, and I'm just repeating what I've heard the regional board tell me. If somebody drives up to your site, they need to not be able to tell there's a construction project going on. So, and it may depend on what regional board you're at and what inspector you have, but that's just been what I've seen. If there's any visible sign that construction's going on, most of the time it'll be denied. So I always hesitate to, I've gotten to the point where I just tell them, no, it won't be accepted. But there are those oddities that sometimes it does. All right, and then timing is everything. Timing is everything. We started by talking about the importance of scheduling. Scheduling is BMP number one, right? It is the most important thing to consider in not only starting your project, but how and when you're going to terminate your project. Here's a real project I worked on. It was the Wani Meadow restoration. In fact, we did a video series on this. You can watch that if you'd like to see more on this. But same meadow, just different times of the year. And in this case, lots of times they try to do the meadow restoration just starting about now and try to, the reason is that a lot of things are now dormant. There's less invasive species I'm sorry, less sensitive species to deal with. And there's less environmental restrictions right now. So that's why they try to do the meadow restoration now. But by the time they're done, it is the end of October, the rains are starting, and especially in areas like Yosemite, it's starting to get colder, and you're just not going to get good germination to happen, not sufficient enough to get an NOT. I have another site, not Yosemite, but one just this morning. I was answering an email on this up on Highway Interstate 80. It's around 3,500 foot elevation. And we were like, hey, if you're going to hydroseed this, you better do it now, because while it's mild, so we can get some fall rains before we get snow, let's see if we can get some germination in. So timing is everything. And having an effective SWP, having effective BMPs, from when you start the project all the way to the end of the project, you got to be thinking about the phasing and the timing of the project to make a SWP realistic, doable, workable. So again, just to kind of close out our time here, I wanted to revisit these two perspectives. You know, which perspective's right? Well, it depends who you ask, right? No, they're both right. They're both right. They're both just looking at the elephant from two different angles. They're both looking at the same thing. They both have reasons to have those perspectives. And so as a SWP writer, we need to make those perspectives come together. we need to make sure we satisfy the contractor's perspective, and we need to make sure that we are obviously satisfying the water board. Otherwise, you know, like they say, if mama ain't happy, nobody happy. We need to make sure that the water board is satisfied as well, but not negating or dismissing or just ignoring the contractor's perspective on it. All right, well, that's a little bit of my experience. We only have 5 minutes left. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself. If you want to talk to me, you can type in a question. Any questions? Or even stories. Somebody want to share something? So nice to see you guys, all of you. I'm going to stop share so I can. Yeah, we got a great group today. And I recognize a lot of the names on here. So nice to see you. Okay, question about the FODs. Will we still implement 3-inch rock with those? No, no, you don't need those. In fact, the construction general permit does not say thou shalt use TC1 as defined by 3 by 5 inch rock, 12 to 16 inches deep, underlain with a geotextile, 50 feet long, 15 feet wide. The construction general permit doesn't say that. Where that comes is from the CASCA and the Caltrans cut sheets. And if I, as a SWPPwriter, say, this is the standard we're going to use, then if I put that in SWP, then that's what they got to do. But that doesn't mean that's the only option. And so these FODs are great options, and they just need to be effective. So if we think we can do it in 30 feet, great. If it takes 60 feet, fine. We just need to make sure it's effective and actually doing the job. But I really like them. I'm going to start specifying them a whole lot more for certain types of projects. Now, if a project has only one entrance and it's the only entrance they'll ever have, then the traditional way is probably just fine. All right. Here's one. The company I work for uses FOBs, and they work great and actually save money for the project on a large job site. Thank you, Gloria. Yeah, that's what I've been seeing. Any other questions, comments? Just got a couple minutes here. Well, while I'm waiting just for maybe, here's another one. How do you get a contractor to use something different than the typical BMPs? That's the trick. You know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? You know, communication. You know, I talked about that earlier. When you have the luxury to be able to communicate with a contractor, sit down with them, say, hey, let's talk about it. I want your project to be successful. I want your project to be compliant, and I want to save you money. And if we accomplish all of that, then that contractor is likely to use me again in the future. And so if I can sit down and say, you know what, look at this alternate Trackout control BMP. What do you think? You know, yeah, I see a little more capital cost, but you're not going to have to install, you know, 10 different Trackout control devices over the course of this entire project. So, you know, we can help them do some of the calculations to see, hey, it actually does cost me money. And that's the way to change a contractor, is when you show them you got a better way to do it and it's more cost effective. So that's a way to do it. All right, good. Well, there's some other good workshops this week. I'm going to be teaching another one on erosion theory. It's a brand new one for me. There'll be some things that you may have heard or seen in the past, but it's a new workshop. Also, don't miss the keynote sessions this week. So today, anytime today, you can watch Amy Cronson, who took Laura Wardrop's place. Some of you may have not heard that, but Laura Wardrop moved on. She's still with the State Water Board, but she is with the Waste Discharge Requirements Division now. And Amy Cronson, who was the construction lead working under Laurel, moved up into Laurel's position. She's now overseeing the construction and the industrial permit. I interviewed her, and you can watch that anytime today. And then on Wednesday is going to be Brandon Rosenboom. he is now the construction lead. And so I interviewed him, both of them, about the current permits and what can we be expecting in the future. So there's some interesting subjects that come up, and I hope you can take advantage of that and all the other quality workshops. Later today, if you do Caltrans work, there's a really good one that I'm looking forward to from Bob Schultz with Verix. And I'm really looking forward to hearing him. And then on Friday, probably the best erosion control person I know in the industry personally is John McCullough. And he will be, I'm actually interviewing him. It's recorded because he couldn't join us live this week, but it's a very good workshop. It was really good video segments on BMPs. So hopefully you can watch that too. So thank you, everybody. And we'll be talking to you later. Send me an email if you got questions.